Hello, my name is Ryan Turner. I'm the artistic director of Emmanuel Music in the city of Boston, an ensemble in residence at Emmanuel Church, an Anglican church as part of the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. I'm thrilled to be with you all at Church of the Redeemer virtually tonight. Last year, Thea Lobo invited me and my wife, soprano Susan Consoli, to join you all for what was to be the Sarasota Bach Festival. Of course, all of that was delayed due to the pandemic, and we had hoped to make it back this year, but out of an abundance of caution, we decided to wait one more year. I suppose the consolation is that I get to be with you all virtually here tonight to speak a little bit about something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and that is the music of Bach. Thea and Sam asked me to discuss the music that you heard this past Sunday morning. Now, before I embark upon this exploration of this remarkable music, I thought it might be helpful to provide a brief overview of the nuts and bolts of a Bach cantata. So I'm often asked, what is a cantata? The term cantata was invented in Italy into the 17th century, and it refers to a piece of music that's written for voices or voices and instruments. By Bach's time, cantatas were generally works that contained several movements or distinct sections with changes in tempo and key. If a work did not feature a solo voice at any point, it was usually called a motet instead of a cantata. Now, we'll be speaking about the Motet Lobert de Nhern later on. The composers in Germany were quite familiar with the Italian cantata, and they copied its structure, as Bach did. Now, the purpose of the cantata in Bach's time is an interesting question, and it's important to put it in the context of the Lutheran church services during the 18th century. They were rather lengthy by our standards, running close to 3 hours, and they included readings, sermon, and hymn singing or chorale singing. The cantata as a genre was generally placed after the sermon, and it served as a musical counterpoint to the preacher's message or a musical meditation on the readings of the day and also the preacher's message. Now, the text for Bach's cantatas, most of his cantatas used librettos. And what I mean by libretto is it was a pre-existing poems that were written by contemporaries which would expand on a biblical or liturgical theme and explore some of the personal implications for the believer. So these cantatas were based on the readings of the day, and it's interesting to put them in the context of an Episcopal worship service, as we do at Emmanuel in Boston, because, of course, the lectionary cycle of 18th century Germany is far different than our 21st century Anglican cycle. They were on a yearly cycle that repeated itself. So you could have, the 13th Sunday after Trinity, for which Bach would have written 3, sometimes even 4 different cantatas based on the exact same readings. Whereas we know, using the Revised Common Lectionary in the Episcopal Church, these readings are not only different than the Lutheran Church of the 18th century, but we're on a 3-year cycle. So finding cantatas that match the readings of the day always presents challenges for Episcopal churches in modern times. I'm often asked also, how many cantatas did Bach write? The official listing of Bach's works, which is called BWV, you'll see in front of a cantata a BWV number, which is the abbreviation for Bach Werke Verzeichnis, which means basically Bach's work catalog or catalog of works. And this catalog begins with the cantatas. The BWV1 is a cantata, Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern. Now, the number of these works have nothing to do with either the date of the composition or the liturgical calendar, but it just reflects the order in which they were cataloged. All the cantatas start from 1 and they go all the way up to 200. So there are existing, that we know of, 200 sacred cantatas and 16 secular cantatas. However, many were lost, and we believe it could be as few as 300 and up to as many as 600 cantatas that have been lost altogether. His total output of vocal works, not just cantatas, but it includes the 6 motets, 3 passions, several oratorial length pieces such as the Christmas oratorio, and a number of secular cantatas that were written for public occasions of mourning or celebration. I want to focus on what I believe makes a Bach cantata special. This is my 10th year at Emmanuel, and before, I should, just as an aside, before I was the artistic director, I sang at Emmanuel as a tenor soloist. I began there in 1997 and got to sing alongside Thea, and then when I assumed the role of music director, before we lost Thea to you all in Sarasota, Thea and I collaborated on a number of cantatas in which she was the soloist. We also sang together overseas with the Boston Camerata and developed a long musical friendship. So it's difficult not to be with you all today. What makes a Bach cantata special? Many of Bach's contemporaries were actively engaged in writing cantatas. One thinks Telemann is probably the most well-known. Bach seized on this form, though, to do some of his most experimental compositions. He used these musical ideas that he had ruminating in the back of his mind somewhere to illuminate, deepen, and sometimes even contradict the message found in the text. The cantata in Bach's hands morphed from being a work of devotion to being a work of psychological exploration. And every emotion is laid out bare and dissected in the painful paradoxes of being human, desiring the good, but as we all do, falling into temptation, fear, and sin, are brought to life in Bach's music. He uses every single musical device available to an 18th century composer, and he puts it into service of the music and the text. One of the things I always think about with Bach cantatas is that, as I mentioned earlier on, the services were quite long. And Bach, the sacred composer of cantatas, was in some ways emancipated from the demands of an audience and, of course, of technology. He had these parishioners, these believers in his midst for 2 to 3 hours, and time was not a factor, nor was their approval or applause. This was an opportunity for him. We often call Bach the fifth evangelist. And here we are with the complexity, ambition, and harmonic daring of his cantatas that, they were probably puzzling and disturbing to his first listeners, as they can still be us to today. So to that point, let's talk about the music that you heard Sunday morning, the last Sunday after the Epiphany. And 2 of the pieces you heard from cantatas are from his second year in Leipzig. He began in Leipzig at the St. Thomas Kirche in the summer of 1723. His second year there, his second cycle, which we call the Jahrgang, began on Trinity Sunday of 1724. And he embarked on an outrageously ambitious endeavor of creating a cycle of chorale cantatas each week. And the piece would be constructed from a different chorale or a different church hymn. Now, just so we're clear about definitions here, a Lutheran chorale is a hymn that's intended to be sung by the congregation during a service. No different than we do in the Episcopal service today. And these works are based on tunes mostly from the early 16th century or even earlier, and they were adapted by the early Lutherans for their new faith, the new Lutheran faith. The chorale texts, which would have multiple verses, sometimes as many as 20, they dated from the Renaissance. And many of these texts were authored by Martin Luther as part of the Protestant Reformation. And many chorale texts were also associated with the same tune. And these tunes were incredibly familiar to Bach's congregation. And he employed them in the vast majority of his cantatas. The most common use of the chorales was a conclusion to a piece, as we think of the final 4-part harmonization, where the tune is prominently audible. But Bach also incorporated these melodies in the texts in many different ways. In this entire cycle, which I mentioned, of cantatas that are based entirely on chorales, which was this year 1724 into 1725, where the chorale tune or chorale text or a paraphrase of it is featured in every single movement. He was trying to, the best way I can explain it is using the tune Amazing Grace. If one started singing, if you heard it in an instrument, you would immediately fill in the text, which is exactly what Bach's congregation would have done with many of these chorale tunes. So I want to start with the duet that Thea sang from Bach's Cantata 78, which is Jesu, der du meine Seele. It was composed in September of 1724 for the 14th Sunday after Trinity. And the gospel for this day is from Luke, and it's about the curing of the 10 lepers. He did 3 different settings of a cantata for this particular Sunday. This is the second one. And it has a very complicated response to this story. It concentrates on the self-doubt, and it brings in the end of an epistle lesson from Galatians as an example of how to live. This cantata has always been one of the most beloved and most discussed of all the cantatas. And certainly the first movement, which of course we didn't hear Thea sing, but is this incredible tour de force. And I just have to speak about it briefly. It's based on a ground bass or a repeated bass line that he combines with a saraband, which is a Baroque dance form of lament where the strong beat comes on the second beat. We think of something in 3/4 as being 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And a saraband gives the strong beat on the second beat. So we get 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And, it's very characteristic of Bach that he would use a ground bass, which has all these heroic and tragic connotations. Specifically, we think of in the Purcell opera Dido and Aeneas, Dido's Lament. But one of the things he does is he turns it into this theological sort of lecture almost, in that he weds this bass line with the most human of forms, which is a dance, the saraband. In doing so, he emphasizes the duality of nature, the human and the divine. And this idea is what dominates the text and the entire cantata. Now, we jump to the duet, which, one could never envision such an abrupt contrast between this opening chorus and this delightful romp, almost frivolous, we would say, of the soprano-alto duet. Bach's wizardry, I would say, almost makes one want to tap their foot or dance when you hear bum bottom bum bum bottom bum bum bottom bum bum bum. I remember as a child singing this with the El Paso Children's Chorus in El Paso, Texas, where I grew up, scored for all the sopranos and all the altos, and us nearly dancing to it. But the irony, of course, is that this duet contains multiple references to the idea of the sinner treading with humbling and stumbling footsteps, and talks about the sickness. And it's this idea of bringing back the leprosy, the disease, the sickness of sin that we're all inflicted with. Writers often discuss this juxtaposition of the opening chorus and the buoyant frivolity of this duet as dramatic. And, I actually kind of think that Bach's point is that these two affects coexist in us all. And it's the idea of sinfulness and our attempt not to be sinful. And while this is, there's a buoyancy to this. If you listen to the B section, there are these clashing dissonances of minor sevenths and seconds where the alto and the soprano are really at odds with one another, almost about the disease of sin. But there's always a coming together, these footsteps, and there's this image I always think of as where we falter away from the teachings of Christ and our faith. That's when the soprano and alto go different ways, and then they ultimately do come together. Just briefly, I'll say that what follows in this cantata after that duet is this tortured tenor recitative about the leprosy of sin that's followed by a delightfully delicate aria that talks about war but in a odd, heroic, delicate way, with the flute being the instrument of heroism. And then we have an accompanied bass recitative, which is in this elevated arioso style that is sort of a meditation on the agony of cross that looks forward to the St. Matthew Passion. It ends with a very straightforward harmonization of the chorale, and it feels as though Bach is painfully aware of the need for normalcy after such an extraordinary variety. We jump to the second, the trio that came from Cantata 38, Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir, or Out of the Depths I Cry to Thee. This also came from that same second Jahrgang, or second cycle of Bach cantatas, where he was writing a cantata once a week based on a chorale tune. And this comes from about 6 weeks later, in late October of 1724, for the 21st Sunday after Trinity. Both of the readings for this Sunday are concerned with the steadfastness of faith against all odds. And certainly the psalm that it's based upon, 130, or Out of the Depths I Cry to Thee, tests that faith. Now, this trio is very curious in that it's one of the only 3 trios that Bach wrote when he was in Leipzig. And it's clearly based on the opening motive of the chorale, Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir. And throughout this cantata, he takes twists and turns this chorale tune upside down, lengthens it, does every possible variation he can of this chorale tune. So it's a little bit of an earworm that we hear throughout the entire cantata. The trio has such an unusual character, nervous, flighty, and the piling up of the 3 voices you heard in tight counterpoint increase in this agitation. Despite all this interesting counterpoint, or what I would call extra musical baggage, where you hear the voices imitating each other, there's a certain operatic quality that exists, and it becomes readily apparent at such moments in the text when they say, Das alles plötzlich von mir fällt, or so that everything suddenly releases me. And what happens is we go away from the counterpoint or the imitative writing to suddenly there's this homophony or gathering point of all the voices coming together in a rhythmic and textual unison. I often think about the moment where it talks about the sun appearing as well. And that's a moment of this wonderful sunrise moment of the voices all coming together. And the final work that you heard, I don't know if this was the right order or not, was the Motet Lobert de Nhern alHayden. The BWV number is 230. And I will say this is perhaps the most mysterious in terms of its date and occasion of the composition. We actually don't know when he wrote this piece or the reason for it. Of the 6 motets, most of them were actually composed for funerals. We don't know that this one was, and odd that there would be an Alleluia in a funereal composition, but it's not necessarily at odds with the 18th century Lutheran German idea of death as a transformation of joy, that death and the ascent to heaven is the only desired activity essentially in life. The text comes from Psalm 117. And of the 6 motets, it's the only one that is set for 4 voice parts and an independent continuo line. All the other motets are either set for 5 voices or double choirs. But as is typical in a Bach motet, each line of text is treated in a unique and colorful way. The opening text is trumpeted out with a volley of impressive fanfares. Yum bum 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 ba da 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 da. This triadic figure that goes. It starts out with the sopranos and works its way down to the basses, and then the next set of texts praise it or praise him. There are these rolling melismas that sort of soften up the edges a little bit. Praise it. You can imagine sort of waves of sound that vary in character from the trumpet-like bum 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 bum. Now, when you listen carefully, you'll hear a reemergence of that Lobet trumpet-like figure. It's a sneaky reappearance that gets buried in the lower 3 voices. The complexity of this, it's almost a double fugue. We have two different um, melodic ideas that exist simultaneously in counterpoint with one another, but it actually relaxes and gives way at the words "denn seine Gnade und Wahrheit," then your truth and grace. And this is set homophonically, all the voices together, as you heard. Um, but at the same time, it's not as simple as one might think of a chorale tune, because there are these octave leaps and all these expressive suspensions with the voices sort of colliding against one another with tension, and then there's release. And yet, then at the mention of the word Ewigkeit, or eternity, there's even new points of counterpoint that spring up over these held notes that show the eternity or the Ewigkeit. And then the piece concludes with this infectious hallelujah, which is fitting, of course, for the last Sunday after Epiphany, before all the alleluias are suspended until Easter. And it's this festive dance, a sort of almost a romp. But as so often with Bach, it's not just a romp. There's much art beneath the surface, and this complexity of rhythmic fragments that are developed very cunningly by means of imitation, where the voices are sort of following one another. It gives a real structure to this concluding, exuberant outburst. I also feel like there should be something that's said about Bach's instrumental character of vocal writing. As a singer myself, I've often thought, gosh, he's not writing for the voice. This music is so difficult. He doesn't give a singer a chance to breathe. And he expected of his singers this instrumental-like virtuosity, sort of the agility of a tightrope walker. And in these motets especially, it's really evident how much he is asking of his singers. In conclusion, what I want to say that I think is perhaps the most compelling and remarkable thing about Bach's music is the way you learn new things as you return to it. I've now conducted all but one of the 200 cantatas, and I've returned to many of them over time. And every time I feel like when I open up that score, it's like Christmas morning, and I've opened a new gift of music that I'm rediscovering, even if I've already opened this gift. And I find new things over and over and over again. And new ways in which it sort of challenges the human condition and challenges us as believers or people that are questioning belief even, about the human condition, about what it means to be a person of faith in the 21st century. And I think Bach equips us better than any other composer to encounter the questions of doubt and questions of faith. And it challenges us as musicians and as listeners. So I want to thank you all for inviting me to be part of the Church of Redeemer programming series. Thanks to Thea, and many thanks to Sam as well for including us folks up here in Boston at Emmanuel. If you ever get a chance, I hope you come up to Emmanuel and see. We do a Bach cantata every Sunday during the church year from September until May, and even during this COVID time, we've been doing cantatas masked and socially distanced with one on a part. And hope you'll come join us. And my wife Susan Consoli, soprano, and I really hope that we can be with you all next February for some Bach in the worship service, and hopefully as part of the Sarasota Bach Festival. Thanks again to Thea and to Sam, and best wishes to all of you, and I look forward to seeing everyone in person. Take care.